What most people would think immediately, if they've been around the block for a while, would think, well, Ray had a porn addiction. And I didn't have a porn addiction. It was just, I didn't know intimacy, didn't know how to do intimacy. The example I had of intimacy growing up was my mom slept in her bedroom and my dad slept on the couch.
Wow.
And even till the day he died a year ago, it was the same way. And it just never seen intimacy.
Hey there, and welcome to the Art of Espousing podcast. We're James and Lisa, and we're so glad you're taking the time to listen today.
If you're here, here's the deal. We believe that every marriage has the potential to go from ordinary to extraordinary, but it doesn't happen by chance. It takes intentional effort, and that's why we're here. In each episode, we share practical tools and insights to help your relationship not just survive, but truly thrive.
We've been through the highs and lows ourselves and know a strong, joyful marriage requires work. So let's dive in and explore how to turn your marriage into the masterpiece God designed it to be. Hey, welcome back to the Art of Espousing podcast. Today, we have a really impactful conversation lined up with two incredible guests, Ray and Linda Raya. Lisa and I have only known Ray and Linda for a short time, but their story of overcoming unimaginable challenges in their marriage instantly grabbed our attention. And we knew right away that we had to invite them to share their journey with you all.
It's true, James. Ray and Linda's story touches on something that many couples struggle with, but they may not even have the language to describe it. Something called Intimacy Anorexia. This is a powerful concept that sheds light on the emotional and physical disconnect that can take place in marriage. We had never heard of this term before either.
That's right.
Ray and Linda have courageously walked through this challenge and come out on the other side so much stronger, healthier, and actually a marriage they've always longed for. It's such an inspiring story, and we're grateful that they're here with us to share it.
Before we jump into our conversation with Ray and Linda, we wanted to remind you about The Collective. This is our new monthly coaching program that's beginning in January, designed to help couples like you thrive in every season of marriage. This program is packed with tools, guidance, and community support to keep you and your spouse connected, growing, and intentional no matter what season you're in. So if you're looking to take your marriage to the next level, we'll encourage you to check out The Collective at the link in our show notes or on our website.
All right, so let's jump into it. Ray and Linda have a unique journey, and we know their story will resound with so many of you. Here's our conversation with Ray and Linda Raya.
So Ray and Linda, it's so great to have you on the podcast. You know, Lisa and I have only known you for a little bit, actually just a few weeks. But when we heard your story, we knew that we needed to get you on the show because your story is so profound, and we know it's going to be so helpful for people who are listening to the show. So thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, James and Lisa, for inviting us to be here. This is exciting, and it'll be great for your listeners to hear what we have to say about what we went through in our marriage.
Yes, awesome. We're happy to be here and be able to share how we overcame.
Yeah.
Because we did. We overcame.
That's awesome. That's
I
awesome.
love it. It is a special story. And not often, James, you and I sit with a married couple and go, we've never heard this before.
Right.
But this is something, the lessons that you've learned and the language that you have around it is something we actually had not heard before. So we really are excited. So can you just start by telling us a little bit about how you two met in the early years of your marriage, what they were like?
Linda and I met in high school. When I met Linda, she was walking down the hallway and she was wearing a white sundress, and I was a very ornery young man, and I threw her sundress up over her head, and that's how we met. And
wow.
And then we kept meeting after that because I kept getting kicked out of class, and she worked in my counselor's office. Oh. And then we just started from there. We actually went on a date. She was a Christian and I wasn't. So it was interesting dating. And then we ended up getting married, 3.5 years later? Is that?
Yes.
About 3.5 years. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because I was a senior in high school and she was a sophomore.
When we met. Yes. And so I was 19, he was 21 when we got married. Then just a couple years later, had our first child, and then just here we are with 7 kids. And
just stop there for seven kids. For all the listeners who have a couple young kids running around, 7 kids.
That's right.
That's amazing.
Okay, I can't get over the sundress thrown over your head. So how did you turn from thinking that was quite annoying to, he's cute? I just am curious if you remember.
I don't. In fact, every time he says that story, I'm like, man, I sound like the bad girl. And I wasn't, not before meeting him. But I guess I don't know, maybe I was wanting a rebel. I'm not really sure, because definitely Ray was the rough rebel that I wasn't used to.
Yeah. It doesn't sound like you're a bad girl. Sounds like you just got You encountered a young man in a very interesting way. And I was just thinking, I may have been embarrassed. Hopefully, you had all your undergarments.
Yes,
I hope so. I mean, that was back before
Girls
thongs, right?
Girls dressed a lot more modest back then. Yes.
That's a good thing. Yeah.
Yes.
I love that.
You guys have been married how long now?
36 years.
36 years. Okay. Ray, you've done a lot of different things. Your career is like pretty cool.
Yeah. I worked in law enforcement for a while in California. And then I went into the military, worked in counterintelligence in Europe, and worked with all the different armed forces when I was over there, and also the CIA. And then when we got out of the military in Texas, we started a company, and now I've had that company for over 30 years. And started many other companies during that time too.
So at what point in your marriage story did you start realizing that there were some issues, that there was something going on?
I'd say from almost day one. Ray kept himself at a distance the best he could. Yes, we have 7 kids, but we had sex 7 times. We had more than that. But what we're going to be talking about today has to do with that.
Right.
So he would push me away. There was a lot of rejection, the silent game, the blaming. But it was early on. He would just, no, I don't want that. And I would think something was wrong with me. I must need to change things. And I would try to change things, and it didn't work.
Now, what most people would think immediately, if they've been around the block for a while, would think Ray had a porn addiction. And I didn't have a porn addiction. It was just, I didn't know intimacy, didn't know how to do intimacy. The example I had of intimacy growing up was my mom slept in her bedroom and my dad slept on the couch.
Wow.
And even till the day he died a year ago, it was the same way. And it just never seen intimacy experienced the way it's supposed to be experienced as a married couple.
We often talk about intimacy being 5 different types of intimacy: physical touch, which is non-sexual intimacy; emotional intimacy; recreational or relational, that it's just fun. You have fun together; emotional intimacy; and sexual intimacy. So I would imagine that even emotional connection may not have been there. Like, of those things. So obviously the sexual intimacy was a struggle, but it sounds like you maybe have been hitting on all of them. Was a disconnect? Every single one. We didn't communicate unless we really had to. Would you say that's correct? There just wasn't there wasn't the spiritual connection. We would go to church because eventually
I got saved.
Yes. And so we would go to church. We would be leaders within the church.
Yeah. We'd be highly lifted leaders in the church, and still not having the intimacy that we needed to have with each other.
We looked good. We smelled good. We acted right out in front of others. But behind closed doors, we were just a whole different story.
So eventually you figured out what this was, right? What was the point that you started realizing, like, okay, this is more than just us not connecting intimately, but there's a real issue here?
So I'd been researching and trying to figure out what this was. And it would look a lot like narcissism, but it wasn't. Like, I knew it wasn't, because there were still those pieces that it wasn't that he was necessarily mean and hateful. Yeah. It just pushed me away. Okay. So I found a DVD at Heart to Heart by Dr. Doug Weiss, online, everything. Thank goodness we have online like we do. We can find anything these days. But I found a DVD called The Sin of Withholding, and I shared it with Ray.
First, I kind of preface that with Linda and I had gone to several marriage intensives up to that point, figuring out what it was that we needed, and never really got the answer. We got great tools how we could help other couples move on in their marriages, and which we used. We used all that. Even though we were broken, we used that to help other couples.
We were at one of the intensives, and we stumped because it was these 2 counselors. And so it was a group of 5 couples, I think.
And they were all pastors and leaders in church and stuff. And somehow we got thrown in that group. It was interesting.
It was great. It was good. But we got a lot of material for other people out of that, not for what we were dealing with. The 2 counselors went off to chat because they would meet individually with each couple. They come back and they're like, I don't know what this is. We don't know what this is. And these are licensed mental health counselors, and they had no clue. Yeah. We stumped them.
They even said, maybe you want to see a sex therapist. And it's like, okay, sure. But when Linda shared the video with me, Withholding, The Sin of Withholding, I watched the video. I said, that's just junk. Okay. And then I called a good pastor buddy of mine in Kansas. And I said, hey, you ever heard of sin of withholding? He goes, well, give me the context of what you're talking about. He goes, oh yeah, that's a sin. The man's supposed to provide for his wife, nurture his wife, do the things for his wife that's what God is. I said, okay, maybe there's something to this. But I honestly, I just felt I was angry. and dumbfounded, thinking, why do I have this issue? What is it in me? I don't understand this. I would say later on, when I finally started researching and get a little more depth, that's when I started feeling shame for what I've done to Linda.
Was it in that video that you learned of the terminology, which is what we were introduced to? What language was given around this sin of withholding?
Well, basically Dr. Doug Weiss calls it, he's been a pioneer in this. It's called Intimacy Anorexia. Okay. And you think about it. What is anorexia? You're starving yourself. I'm starving intimacy from the one that I'm supposed to be giving it to, because it didn't affect others. I mean, everyone else around me raised the life of the crowd. Oh man, he gives and does this and handles stuff. But when it came to his wife, she wasn't the one being fed and not being nurtured and being covered.
Because with your other relationships, you didn't have to share. You didn't have to get deep.
That's right. Yeah.
So opening up, you didn't have to do that.
You're right.
And that's part of it.
And part of some of the signs of an intimacy anorexia is someone who's too busy, who's always blaming, withholding love, withholding spirituality, withholding praise, withholding sex, or they do anger, or they have silence. Okay, and they're constantly criticizing their spouse, or they're unable to share their feelings, or you just feel like roommates. You're two ships passing in the night. You don't have any connection, but you just sleep in the same house and you pay your bills and you both have the same last name.
It's interesting because when we talked about this, one of the things that you said to us was that because you're a serial entrepreneur as well, like you have multiple businesses and
shouldn't have you two guys together that much. Yeah.
But that was part of it, right? Like
yes.
You mentioned that one of the signs is you're overly busy and constantly giving yourself to other things besides your spouse.
I mean, one thing that I didn't mention is that, like, when we were in Kansas City area, I coached baseball outside of having all my companies. Linda would sometimes tell me, she'd go, how's your other wife? Because baseball, I coached with our three sons. They were competitive AAA major teams. And then I also had 9 other teams underneath me. So I had 12 teams. And when we moved from Kansas to Florida is when, I promised her I wouldn't coach anymore. So I'd made one step towards it. And I still hadn't really known what was wrong with me, what my addiction was, because intimacy anorexia is an addiction. Okay. You can choose to do it or choose not to do it. What happens, I think a lot of Christian people forget, is that we look at the season in our life and we take it, and that's a sentence on our life. And it's not that. We all, just like a business owners, we have seasons, and it's moving us on to the next level. And we just got to make sure that we don't accept it as, well, this is where we're at. We're going to be stuck here. So we seeked help. We went out and found the help that we needed to get.
So when you came to the issue, this idea of intimacy anorexia, was it just like a light bulb that one was like, that's what this is? And like, how did you feel? Like, was it a relief for you?
Absolutely. It was relief because there was finally a name, and it wasn't that I was crazy, because part of the blaming is gaslighting, if anybody's familiar with that term. And so it was always like, no, it's not that. That's not right. You're not feeling that way, kind of thing, or that didn't really happen. And so finally I had relief. But at the same time, I had so much anger. I was like, I've been upset, but like I could finally just, all these years, decades, we're talking decades at this point, that I'd been dealing with this. This has been our marriage, which was really, you almost can't call it a marriage. It was really just a contract at that point, because we never really had that togetherness that we now can say we have.
I love, Ray, that you said you made that one step. And so even to answer your question, James, like the aha, I'm just imagining that this was like that one step. It's like how God works in our life always. We make one step toward obedience, then he starts giving us the next step. And he's so gracious with us to not unload it all at one time, but just
right.
So the ball started rolling, but what was the next step that actually started giving you momentum and working through the emotions you had, the work, Ray, that you need to do to start communicating, to start having intimacies, to start leaning in? What did that look like?
That would be going to the intensive that is at Heart to Heart Counseling Center, which is where we learned of intimacy anorexia. So they have specific intensives for couples dealing with that. And they work together with us. They break us out into the women and the men. And so you can work specifically with what you're struggling with. And for me, the material that I used with that was called Married and Alone. And that is exactly how you feel when you're a roommate with your spouse, is married and alone. And that was probably the best way for me to describe how I felt. I had 7 kids and I had a husband and we had this great house. We had everything, but I felt very alone.
And so many men get stuck on that. Hey, I'm providing for my family. I've got a roof over their head. They got food. They've got money. They got the things they want and need. And they forget the one thing they really need is what God instilled in us to be, is the spiritual covering, the intimate covering for their spouses. And I would say during this time, one of the things I think we probably want to make sure we hit a point on is that Linda felt relief knowing that, okay, this is what the challenge was. Ray has intimacy anorexia. But she also, like she said, when she felt angry, because, okay, now he's going to be good. We're going to get him fixed. But what about the trauma that I experienced? Yeah. And that's one of the things that's very important, that when people do go there, that they go and they understand, first, you need to get yourself right. They talk about that there. They say that if your wife were to leave you today, are you still going to continue to get your healing and go through? A lot of guys question themselves, well, I don't know. But you got to be doing it for yourself. You got to be doing it to make yourself better. And the byproduct is your marriage gets fixed. And some people, their marriage doesn't get fixed. They have so much trauma because they deal with also sex addicts there, porn addicts, all the different addictions in that aspect. So some of them, they're still battling that. There's a weekly call I jump on with other guys. It's an hour and we just talk. There's some struggle we're having. Just because you go there doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes.
Right.
And we all make mistakes. The key goal is just don't make that same mistake again.
Right.
And keep moving forward.
I would assume that, you didn't have a pornography issue,
no.
But I would think that people who do have a pornography issue probably are more susceptible to intimacy anorexia, right?
Yes, they are. Because they've put themselves into this
fantasy world.
And there's so much into that then they try to make their spouse live into that little zone of how they think sex should be, how they think a woman should be. It just messes up their whole perception of marriage and sex and everything.
And porn is really just having... it's like having a relationship with a screen. So it's an inanimate object. You
don't have to connect.
You don't have to connect. Quite a few people with porn addiction also do have IA. They go together, but it's not as frequent that you just find IA by itself.
Yeah.
Part of the process of the IA recovery is they set certain standards for you as a couple when you're making love. One of them is the lights on in the room.
Okay.
No darkness. Okay. And that your eyes are open and you're making that intimate connection with each other, and then you're talking to each other. And it's kind of ironic. You think about the porn industry figured out a long time ago, because anyone that watches porn movies, that's what they're always focused on. They're having the person's eyes look straight at the camera, and they're trying to make that connection because they want to connect. If they can get you hooked onto that, that's where your intimacy is connected versus with your spouse.
Well, as I think about this, it is interesting with the porn connection that this kind of intensive would be just as helpful to someone who has that struggle in their life. And as I talk to women often on the other side of a porn addiction, it makes me even think about, Linda, how did you stay supportive through this process? Even though it was in a porn addiction, that disconnect, even as Ray was learning to stay connected and probably had a relapse of like pushing away or turning away or learning a whole new skill set that he didn't actually know. So how did you stay supportive through the struggle as y'all were gaining strength?
I guess for me, it was really just pressing into God. It was my relationship with him. And I had to get so tight with him and really understand who I was in him for me to be able to get through this. I had to walk in forgiveness 7 times 70, right? Mm-hmm. Anytime that I would see him start to slip back, I had to forgive him again. And I had to believe that there's still hope, because it's real easy when they slip back to feel hopeless, right? To feel like, oh, here we go again. I had to not focus on that. I had to focus on where we were headed, how far we'd already come, and the Lord, really. Right. So I would get in my quiet place, my secret place. I would worship. I would pray, just dig into the Word, and just stand on the Word. And that is how I was able to continue to be supportive of Ray and not keep bringing it up, because bringing it up when he's in the process of healing was not going to be helpful for him.
A lot of couples fall into that too, because that's the trauma, the wounds. And you guys probably see that when you're doing your reboots with marriage with couples, is that they'll bring up, he did this to me. 10 years ago, and we got to move on. But at the same time, you got to keep, and I see what happened because I do a lot of men in men's ministry. Mm-hmm. I see men come to my Saturday group and then they disappear for a couple months and then they're back. And I said, "Oh, you stopped working, didn't you?" So what do you mean? I said, "Your wife's upset with you and now you're back." And they go, "How'd you know?" I said, "Well, that's what happens." And what happens is with us men and women, we get to a certain point where we're working, we're doing great things. You're in this incline, you're moving up. And then you get to a point where you say, "Oh, okay, everything's fine in my marriage. Everything's great." And you stop doing the work you were doing. Mm-hmm. And then you start slowly sleeking back to where you were at.
Yeah.
And you got to continue to keep it working. A marriage is not easy. It's work. If it was easy, we wouldn't have all the divorces we have today.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the journey from when you identified intimacy anorexia and started working on that? Was it, okay, we're on it, we're going? Or was it like, was it back and forth?
It was definitely back and forth at first. Yes. I'd say the first couple years when we first discovered what this was, we were back and forth for sure. But then what happened was, this is another video from Doug Weiss, the pain for love, because you're giving so much just to get this little bit of love, this little bit of, okay, he does love me. But the pain for love was so bad that I told Ray, I said, either you change or we're done. And I throw the divorce word around there in the past, but he knew it was just like, whatever, she's mad because we lived this for so long. But this was like, he knew it. He just knew it. And that was when things really changed. And that's what got us to where we are now. He sincerely repented. He realized how much pain I had been in and that he had been causing all this pain. And the man, he has such a hard time. He did have a hard time crying. He would hold me and he would cry and he was so sorry. And he would ask me daily if there's anything else that I needed to share with him. And I could unpack the pain in a safe place where I was not safe with him. Not physically, but emotionally, I was not safe until really that time.
Yeah.
So this felt like a turning point where things started getting traction. Mm-hmm. So Linda, it was like, Ray, we got to move forward. And so something locked in his spirit and he was able to provide more intimacy, emotional connection. Oftentimes we see in marriages when they're trying to steward this vulnerability, it is violated, like maybe something that's brought up, a vulnerable moment would be weaponized later. How did you guard against that? Is there any advice of how you kept moving forward and sharing your heart, and even Ray, you sharing your heart, knowing it was a safe place?
I did have to worry about that for the majority of our marriage, for sure. But there was such a change in him. Is like his heart was so transformed. Really, our marriage is a miracle. The fact that we're still together, and that there was just that change when he said, "You know what? I don't want to hurt her anymore. I don't want this. I want to leave a different legacy for my family." I knew just his heart was different. The walls came down. He had walls around his heart his whole life. I'd say from the time you were probably a very young child. And so he didn't really know how to receive love before. But then once he opened up and was willing to receive it and understand how to accept it, he became vulnerable so I could feel safe and be vulnerable. Because I walked on eggshells most of my marriage. And I can say today that I don't. And I can say that I really understand Ephesians 5:25. It makes sense to me. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Because I did not like that scripture. Because I'm like, there's no such thing, you know. But I have told so many people that since he's been healed that I get it. And I never thought I would ever understand that scripture or be able to feel it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm wondering, we always talk about like when there's emotional affairs or whatever, there's always two sides of the story. If you're willing to share, how did you feed that lack of intimacy? Like what was going on? How did, as a spouse, because I know there's probably a lot of spouses who are sitting in your seat.
Absolutely.
What did you do through that season?
So for the most part, I was empty. Mm-hmm. And obviously I was still empty, but there was a pastor that saw what was going on and took advantage of that and ended up in an affair. I'm guilty too. But that was kind of the beginning of, we didn't know this was IA, didn't know anything about intimacy anorexia, but that was a little bit of a turning point, not the big turning point, but it was the beginning of, wow, I need to do something about this. So it was a brief, but it happened.
Before we knew what intimacy anorexia was. Like, that was a new term to us. We deal with couples all the time that one spouse or the other is trying to fill a void in their life. Through this whole season, there's obviously healing that had to take place in your life as well, right?
Right, absolutely. So I had to heal from what I dealt with all those years. And then I had to heal from what I did, which was, to me, was devastating. That was what put me in the deepest depression that I had ever had, because how could I do that? How could I sin like that? There's books for the men, there's books for the women. My study, my course was Married and Alone, and it just walked me through. It's a 12-step program, so it's just something I never thought I'd be doing, a 12-step program. But it was digging in, making you dig in and just realize what you'd been through and what you're worthy of. And it turned it around. It brought healing.
You're a big believer in 12-step, aren't you, Lisa?
I am. I'm going through it for the third time, and I always find discoveries that God is wanting to give me and learn and apply in my life. You know, y'all's story is so deep and complex. And sometimes we may have listeners right now that are like, gosh, this is too hard to get out of. I'm so deep in this. It's so complex. There's no way God could redeem it. And your story is, and we're just touching and highlighting.
Yes.
We're not even talking about all the work, the moments of messing up and having to come back and start all over again and believing and forgiving, and how intense and the shame that comes with all of it. And so I believe this has been a time just to really breathe hope into people that your story's never too far gone.
Every mess becomes a message, right?
It does.
Yep.
It's really profound, as just thinking about couples that we work with and relationships that we know that feel like there's just no hope. And the fact that you guys have found hope and strength and victory. I am wondering a little bit, you mentioned the passage in Ephesians. How did your faith journey play in through your healing?
I don't know how anybody makes it without God and without that relationship. I know that we didn't have a relationship with him in the beginning, right? Or I would hope we wouldn't have got here, but things happen, people fall. But a relationship with him is what for sure got us through this.
I would say you're right, honey, because you got to have hope. Without hope, you're lost. And just by pressing into the Lord and knowing that, okay, this is a season we're going through. This is something that he's got something better for us. And there was times that I'd ask God, why are we going through this? Why us? And, he actually literally answered me one time, says, because I know you can handle it. And we didn't realize until we actually came to Florida that the couples that we've been dealing with in our own current church, we've actually had some that they're just parallel with what we were doing. I mean, especially younger couples. And we're just like, okay, Lord, I see this is what you brought us here for. This is what you want us to do. And I think that a lot of men, we have this problem. Some guys, I'm not going to be shamed like that. I'm not going to admit I have this problem. I think the bigger shame is not standing up and taking on that problem and saying, listen, what's the solution? And where can I move forward in my marriage and not be a failure there? And like when Linda, she talked about her affair, our pastor at the time said, Ray, you're responsible for this. Linda has her responsibility. I said, you're right. I'm the one that pushed her away. I'm the one that didn't give her intimacy. I didn't give her love. I didn't do it what I was supposed to do as a man, as a husband, and he kind of told me at the time, he says, you're going to die 1,000 deaths. And there was a lot of flesh that needed to die, a lot of false beliefs. A lot of Christians have weaponized the scripture to their beliefs. Men especially love this scripture. It says, wives submit to husbands, okay? They forget the whole text of everything, that you both are submitting to each other and walking alongside each other. She's the weaker vessel. I love hearing that one. Because she's the weaker vessel. That means you got to take care of her.
Right.
It means you got to be the strength around that vessel. Not that she's not worthy. She's still your companion and still your helpmate and still your partners in this. I've seen in our groups that we have people who are not of Christian faith. They usually don't make it because they don't have that connection. There's just the connection with the Lord that it funnels through you and it says, okay, you know what? Today was hard, but tomorrow's going to be better.
That's good. I was going to ask you, Ray, and you answered it, but I feel like I want to ask the question that you already answered. So oftentimes we find when someone has had an affair, you could have easily just made that the target of conversation and not learned what you needed to learn. But what a stand up to just own your own piece, your own responsibility, and be able to say that. Linda still had her things she needed to work through, walk that out and be right. But I think sometimes when things get real messy like this, people want to point at the other person, even if it's really devastating. And so we often say, draw the circle around yourself.
Right.
And work on everyone in the circle. Right. And that's exactly what you both have said, is like letting God do a work in you. And I love one of y'all's marriage mottos. We talk about that in the Marriage Reboot. And I'm thinking you're going to know which one it is. You had a couple, but does one come to mind that you know that I'm just going to love?
Doing the harder right than the easier wrong.
I love it. I love that. Yeah. Do the harder right than the easier wrong. And that is exactly what the two of you have been doing for lots of years. And that's what it takes. To make a rich marriage. It does.
It's amazing you mentioned that, Lisa, because during that time, I had a lot of Christian people come to me and say, you have the right to divorce her. You have the right to divorce her. And I'm like, that's not a right. I said, the better solution, you should say, you have the right to love her now.
Come on.
And work through this and get on with this and show others that marriage in a Christian home is supposed to work no matter what each other do. You know, you work together and get things, you get a solution. You got to be a solution finder in your marriage, not a problem. Too many people focus on the problems, and the couples we deal with are always bringing up this. And I'm like, stop. Let's work on the solutions because that's what's going to build your home, build your marriage, and build your family.
Yeah, it's so good. That's so good. If you could speak to maybe a couple who's listening right now to this podcast, who's one of the spouses is maybe dealing with intimacy issues, or maybe both are, who knows? Maybe it's the husband, maybe it's the wife, but what advice or what counsel, what word would you want to speak over their life if they're listening to this kind of going, man, that kind of sounds like us?
Well, I would start with God is no respecter of persons. If he can do it for us, if he can transform our marriage from where it was, from that icky, yucky mess that we were in to what we have today. He literally, like you had said, he took our mess and made it into a message so that we can help others.
Yeah.
Then he can definitely do that for anyone.
All right.
Because this was decades. And we overcame. And we are so in love.
Yeah.
And it's not just by words, it's by actions. Because I believe behavior. And I would tell him that a lot during the few years that we were really in the deep healing. I believe behavior.
Yeah.
And I do. But if he can do it for us, he can do it for anyone. What would you want to add, honey?
What I would say is, and Linda hit a key point there, your words are worthless if your actions are not showing what you're preaching. And I would also highly recommend to couples out there, especially in the church, so many people in the church are spreading themselves thin and doing things and getting involved. Why I do this, I do that. You know, what are you doing for your wife? What are you doing for your husband first? What are you doing for your family? Because that's your first ministry.
Yeah.
And people miss that.
Yeah.
And I would just say that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but you've got to focus on it. And you both got to get on track and work towards it. And one of the tools that we used to do that is Dr. Doug Wise and them have a sex agreement. And we sat down and spoke. How many times a week? Or do we do it like a tennis match? I initiate and then you initiate the next time. You know, I guess
it's not having sex like you're playing tennis.
You serve. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's a worksheet called Sexual Garden where you talk about what is okay in the bedroom. And then there's the dailies that they created. We share a feeling that you've experienced in the last 24 hours, and then you compliment the other spouse on the next one, the feeling you share. It's not supposed to be about them. And then you pray together. And that's what I found, especially leading men. I found that a lot of men are afraid to pray with their wives and I think it's because they're just so scared of that connection they're going to make. And the men that I lead, I say, listen, you got to be praying every day. I'm going to ask your wife. I see her. Is she praying with you? And she says, no, we're going to have a talk because you got to have that connection.
Yeah.
So many people judge themselves. They see a pastor on stage. Wow, look at that. He's so eloquent how he prays. They think that's how they have to pray. No, you just pray how you pray.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the Lord's going to hear you.
That's good.
And I would say don't let shame stop you from seeking help. Because if you were being physically abused, you would get help. People would see it but emotional abuse, it's sad to say, but in a lot of churches and a lot of the Christian world, they wouldn't see this as emotional abuse.
Right.
They would say, oh, it's fine. It's just, you just need to do this or you just need to do that. And that's what a lot of women are told. Don't let shame stop you from seeking the help. And it may not be in your circle because a lot of people don't understand this. Find somebody that understands it and that you can trust.
Yeah, that's good.
Linda, one of the things you said when we were getting to know you the first time, you said you wanted him to take care of himself physically because you finally have the man and the husband you've always wanted.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that. The love that y'all have for each other is just so beautiful. And if you haven't been able to see that in hearing this conversation, I'm sure you have, but we've seen it. And just in the short amount of time that we've known you. And Ray, I love the just call up to men that you give. And there's no excuses. Our lead pastor, he would say, this is going to be a face mask moment. Like he's a coach, our founding pastor. He'd grab you by the face mask and go, give it to you. I just see that you're that way, but in love. And Linda, I'm sure you do that the same with women that you're with, of helping them have a dose of reality in a very palatable way. So yes. I love that about you guys. We're so thankful to have had this conversation with you.
Yeah, I appreciate your vulnerability. One of the things that you were just sharing about the love garden, what did you call it? The
sex garden.
Sex garden and sex contract.
Yeah.
Is some people may be listening to that kind of going, that's silly. One of the things that we learned just recently from one of our friends is that a lot of married couples, they really don't have bad hearts towards one another. They just have bad skills. And using a tool like that just helps you to develop the skill so that it becomes more natural, right? You have to work on that skill, work on that craft till it becomes more natural. And it's become more natural to you guys as you guys have worked on those tools. So, but thank you so much for your vulnerability. And I know that you guys are stepping into a whole new season of working with couples and coaching couples. And we're going to put your contact information in the show notes. If maybe there's some couples who are dealing with this, they could reach out to you guys, right?
Yes.
And talk about this. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Wow, what an incredible story. Ray and Linda's journey shows us all that healing and transformation is possible, even when the journey feels long and challenging. We're so grateful they were willing to share their story with us and to be open about their struggles and victories.
Yeah, their transparency about intimacy anorexia and the steps they had to take to rebuild their intimacy emotionally, spiritually, and physically is such a great testament to the power of God's redeeming work in marriage. If you resonated with their story or want to learn more, we've included their contact info in the show notes. Don't hesitate to reach out to them if you feel they could support you on your own journey.
Yeah, and remember, if you're looking for more resources and intentional support to strengthen your marriage, be sure to check out The Collective. We created this coaching program for couples who want to grow through every season together. You can find out more details on our show notes or at artespousing.com.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you, Ray and Linda, for being such a blessing to all of us. We will see you next episode. Until then, keep investing in your marriage, drawing closer together through every season. Until then, bye-bye. Hey friends, before you go, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Art Espousing and sign up for our newsletter in the show notes to stay updated on all things Art Espousing. We've got some exciting announcements coming soon and you're not going to want to miss out.